What's up, everybody? It's Chicago Talk Show host, and I'm here with another book review, this time on Music and Morals, a theological appraisal of the moral and psychological effects of music, written by Basil Cole, OP. OP stands for Order of Preachers, or in Latin, Ordo Praedictorum. So there you go. I was prompted to read this book because of Dr. E. Michael Jones' book on the dangers of beauty, which I highly recommend you do. Check out the book review I did on that, because he actually quotes it. He actually quotes it on one of his introductory pages in the book. And I thought to myself, who's this Basil Cole person? What's this book called, Music and Morals? And so I figured if it was good enough for E&J to read, it's good enough for me. And so I took a look. But why? Why did I want to read this book? Well, did you ever notice how music isn't just like this thing, right? Clearly, music has an impact on the emotions, the ability to stir the emotions, right? A lot of people listen to music before they work out. They want to get pumped up before a big day. So music, in this sense, is used as a medium to kind of elevate or potentially match the certain emotion level where someone is at, which is interesting, right? How can that be? How can music do that, right? We love music. We love listening to it, maybe too much. And we use it as this sort of tool, right? This, there's all kinds of things going on in the world, but music is this sort of refuge for a lot of people, right? But what about limits? There's something to be said about that. There's something to be said about overindulgence, right? There's different kinds of music, as you and I both know, right? There's all kinds of, jazz music, rock and roll. You got the rap music, right? And I get it, right? There's classical music, liturgical music, and there's different kinds of instruments, right? And there's certain kinds of instruments that are used particularly per type of genre of music, right? So you're not going to listen to a harp in the middle of a rap music. Maybe there is a harp in some rap music, but I highly doubt it. So one thing that's pretty interesting to me is the idea of trance music, right? You've got rock and roll music, you got rap music, you got classical music, you got trance music. What's going on there, right? So it's this idea where you listen to this sort of music and it's supposed to maybe put you in a different state of mind, right? Whether it's supposed to be meditative or whatever, but there's this sort of hypnotizing element to trance music. How can that be? Well, it probably has to do with things like the frequency, the certain kind of beat, and the repetition of the beat in a certain way, which goes to show you that music isn't just this innocuous thing, right? I'm not saying that trance is harmful, but there's something about it, right? When I think of trance, I think of like some sort of a spell cast to kind of like put you in a different state of mind, and then whether you're conscious of it or not. And I'm not saying it's all nefarious, but it's interesting that kind of music is dedicated to put you in this hypnotic state, and it speaks to the power of music. So going back to the idea of music having an effect, right? It can have an effect on the body or the mind. So what does that mean? Well, in one sense, it means that it can be exploited. So it just so happens to be true that that there is a satanic Hollywood industry, right? We just saw the Grammys to kind of just show it in your face. These are people who worship Satan and demons, and there's a certain degenerate culture that goes along with it, and it's up to you whether you want to accept or reject it. And so it goes to show you that, again, we're not just listening to just notes on paper that is played with certain instruments. There's more going on to it. And that is my prelude to what morals have to do with music, right? Why can't we just listen to music and just be carefree, right? We just want to enjoy like the beats and the sort of thing. I get it, right? I like the idea of that too. But it just so happens that there are a lot of people out there that use music and know that it can be this powerful force to impact you and thus impact society, whether you like it or not. It does exist, right? The satanic music industry, it's there. And you can say, hey, well, that's that sort of thing. I'm just going to go my own way. That's fine too, but we are talking about the masses and pop culture, right? And then we get into, right, things that have to do with propaganda and social engineering and the purposeful push of that sort of degeneracy. And what does it mean? Well, it means for a lot of the ancients, like Plato used to, it can signal this sort of a decay of the state, right? A sort of decay of society. Is that the best thing, right? Probably not. And so all I'm trying to say is, if you ever thought that there was more to music and you had a suspicion that it had to do with ethics, you're not alone. And this book will provide you that kind of insight. So the first chapter is called Posing the Issues. Here's one of them. And it has to do with jazz. Right. So jazz was a thing, right? Or jazz is a thing. But when jazz was coming about, there was a certain turbulence that came with it, right? This new kind of sound, this sort of energy that came with it. It was kind of a shock to the culture at the time, a lot of the mainstream. And what did that mean? I mean, I get it, like jazz is awesome, but at the same time, it is interesting to know those kind of impacts it had culturally and the impacts it had as far as society goes. And there's much to be said about that. But as the reader, you decide, right? And so here's one passage. This is from chapter 1, Posing the Issues. And it goes like this. In addition to this present work was prompted by some of my theological... Basil Cole writes, in addition, this present work was prompted by some of my theology professors back in the late 1950s at the University of San Francisco, who suggested that something immoral existed in jazz music due to its strong rhythms and sensuous melodies. Such attitudes were well summed up in 1958 by Cyril Scott when he wrote the following. After the dissemination of jazz, which was definitely, quote, put through, end quote, by the dark forces, I should note that dark forces here is capitalized, a very marked decline in sexual morals became noticeable. Whereas at one time women were content with decorous flirtations, a vast number of them are now constantly preoccupied with the search for erotic adventures, and thus have turned sexual passion into a species of hobby. Now, it is just this overemphasis of the sex nature, this wrong attitude toward it, for which jazz music has been responsible. The orgiastic element of its syncopated rhythm, entirely divorced from any more exalted musical content, produced a hyper-excitement of the nerves and loosened the powers of self-control. It gave rise to a false exhilaration, a fictitious endurance, and insatiability resulting in deleterious moral and physical reactions. Whereas the old-fashioned melodious dance music inspired the gentler sentiments, jazz, with its array of harsh, ear-splitting percussion instruments, inflamed, intoxicated, and brutalized, thus causing a setback for man's nature towards the instincts of his racial childhood. For jazz music at its height very closely resembled the music of primitive savages. A further result of it was to be seen in the love of sensationalism, which has so greatly increased. As jazz itself was markedly sensational, the public has increasingly come to demand thrills, that's in quotes, in the form of, quote, crook dramas, end quote, and plays, the only dramatic interest of which is connected with crime, mystery, and brutality. This also applies to sensational fiction, for the sale and output of this type is prodigious. Let's talk about that really quickly. So, you know how like a lot of film noir, cinema noir, like things that like old school like crime film. There's a certain kind of jazz element that so heavily accompanies that sort of cinema, right? That's interesting, right? That connection. It's not like rock and roll music or whatever version of rock and roll was there. It's not some sort of a tribal, local music. It's not some sort of anything else. It's particularly jazz music, right? You got the detective. He's working on the scene. Some dame has been brutally murdered, perhaps mutilated by some sort of sex-crazed monster, right? And the detective in the black and white, he's hunting for the killer, and he's got this jazz beat behind him, right? Counting the steps, the whole fury of it. Or maybe the actual murder scene is accompanied by some crazy jazz music in the background. I don't know, but it's interesting, right? It just goes to show you that there's more going on here than meets the ear. I'll put it that way. So yeah, jazz is a trip, right? Why did fascist governments ban it, right, when it was coming about? Why did a lot of the beatniks during the late 50s and 60s, guys like Jack Kerouac, this white Catholic kid who, for all intents and purposes, idolized Negro culture, and why did jazz speak to him so much, right? What did it do to that culture? It's interesting to think about, right? I love me some jazz. I love me Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, really great stuff. I like the different kind of beats and all kinds of craziness that goes with it, and certainly the energy. But it is interesting that sort of thing was regarded as on the side of things like debauchery or degeneracy. What are we talking about here? Why is that? Well, it has to do with, I suspect it has to do with things like the loosening of morals, the loosening of restraint, the loosening and the giving way of something about the reserved. I'll put it that way. So this is a second part that I liked from the first chapter called Posing the Issues, and it is as follows. So the subchapter is called The Contemporary Music Scene, and Basil Cole writes, in more recent years, the availability of all kinds of music which people can, quote, tune into, end quote, and, quote, turn onto, end quote, at the switch of a dial has set off subtle and not so subtle alarms in many quarters. These alarms are both legitimate and false, as Alan Bloom explains in the following remarks. The present generation is addicted to music, much as Germans were addicted to Wagner in the 19th century. School, family, church have nothing to do with their musical world. It is available 24 hours a day. 30 years ago, people made children listen to European music because they not only liked it, but also thought it would do some good for them. Today, few have an acquaintance with classical music. No classical music can speak to this present generation. Previously, students looked down upon Plato's obsession with music as a political brackets tool end brackets because for them music was entertainment. Today, students dispute. Plato threatens today's student who likes rock. Let's break that down a little bit. So, the person who's enjoying the music, I get it. I was 16, 18 years old too at one point. When I was listening to all kinds of rock music back then, Korn and rap rock music like Insane Clown Posse, did I care what Plato thought about that? No. Did that perhaps impact the sort of lifestyle I was heading into as an adult? Maybe. Would things have changed if I was kind of like focused on listening to the greats more often? Like if someone were to introduce me to the world of Beethoven and Mozart, would I have kind of maybe become a little bit different? I don't know. But it is interesting to think about, right? So this third passage that I really liked, it goes as follows. Basil Cole writes, psychology and even physical health can be facilitated by music. Not only on the psychiatrist's couch or hospital bed, but also in the teaching process. Educators have long recognized that certain kinds of music can provide an outlet for feelings and emotions and keep students from becoming too locked in to the rational. Bloom asserts, however, that, quote, rock, end quote, reflects a desire for sexual release, not love or eros. Everything is legitimate. This music is specifically composed, he insists, to encourage an orgiastic state of arousal for the purpose of satisfying the voracious sexual appetites of adolescents and young adults. But is it the music as such that does this, or something else? The lyrics of much contemporary popular music celebrate puppy love or need love and fortify adolescents against peer ridicule, sense of personal shame, or any call to self-control. Older children and adolescents with little or no concept of the responsibilities of love, marriage, and family are encouraged by some rock and rap music to indulge in sex in a routine and casual manner, calling such behavior natural and normal. Rebellion against parental strictures which try to encourage them to keep the sexual instinct under control has also been a characteristic of the music of the last 20 years or so. Also suggested by this trend is a notion that sexual prowess must replace the repressive forces of religion and parental authority, leading to overt hatred for aspects of the present cultural and political order. So that's interesting, right? That third passage of the first chapter. So what's going on there? Maybe you can relate. So that makes complete sense, right? Especially when we think of like our, the boomers and Gen X, right? They've been exposed to things like I mentioned earlier, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, right? This sort of music where it's just like, yeah, this laissez-faire, this promotion of, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? And, what also came with it is that sort of sense of rebellion, right? This rock and roll sense of like, you don't have to listen to mom and dad. Go out there and have some fun. You're young, and you can do it. Right? But again, it goes back to that one saying that just because you can doesn't mean that you should. But when we're young, there's a lack of maturity, right? So there's a lack of wisdom that goes with it. This idea of just like, okay, yeah, go ahead and, break away from what this crazy church is saying about restraint and, don't have sex until you get married. Your parents saying, more or less the same thing as far as being careful with your sexuality, if they even talk to you about it at all. At least I was growing up with this idea that studies come first, right? Girls are going to be around, but you need to make sure you do your homework and do good in school and go to college, right? That sort of rhetoric. Again, that sort of restraint as far as priorities. But again, the music, right? The rock music is, especially some of the stuff that, I listen to. Again, I mentioned Insane Clown Posse earlier. It wasn't limited to that. All kinds of music I listened to, all kinds of rock music in particular. And, a lot of it had to do with just, in a sense, trying to promote this liberating behavior. Just like, yeah, go out there and have sex. Yeah, just go out there and indulge in all the things that you want to do to make you feel good.
Right? Because if it feels good, then what's so bad about it?
Right? It's not gonna, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody.
Go ahead and do it.
But the fundamental flaw with that sort of thing, that sort of belief that it's just...
It's like, yeah, if it doesn't hurt anybody, do whatever you want.
Is that so often you end up hurting... You may not hurt other people, but you end up hurting yourself, right? You end up hurting yourself in the long run. It's like, yeah, you can have all this premarital sex when you're young, you're 16 or you're 15 or whatever, and you're doing all these things. Okay, sure, you can, but what's that going to be like as when you get older? And what's that going to be like if you get pregnant? Right? And then now you're in trouble. Now you're maybe thinking about things like abortion, or you're struggling to like maybe find out a way to marry the person who knocked you up. Suddenly things get complicated, right? Suddenly that song that's saying
Have all the sex you want.
doesn't have that same kind of answer as far as like, here's what you do with the consequences of that choice. It doesn't have that. It's too busy casting its spell to just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Who cares about whatever happens? If it does happen to you, that's your problem. You're on your own, right? And so I think that's messed up, right? And that's the short end of a lot of that kind of music. It promotes this sort of degeneracy and this sort of behavior, but at the same time, it ignores the consequences of that sort of thing, much to the detriment of that individual consuming that type of music, especially when they're young. So there you go, rant over. All right, so now I'm going to share 3 things from chapter 2, which is called The Ancient Witness. And so without further ado, here's number 1. Basil Cole writes. He writes about Confucius and what Confucius thought. So, pretty smart guy. So, he writes about what he said. Here we go. Basil Cole writes, Confucius represents China's first major philosopher to set forth his views regarding music and its relationship to morals. He is the first in a long line of thinkers, East and West, to pursue such a line of speculation about music to Aquinas himself. Even though he had no direct influence on Western philosophers or theologians, some of them could easily have espoused his views, which are so much like those of Plato. 4 important selections from his works specifically deal with music and morals. Here it is. In the periods of disorder, rites are altered and music is licentious. Then sad sounds are lacking in dignity. Joyful sounds lack in calm. When the spirit of opposition manifests itself, indecent music comes into being. When the spirit of conformity manifests itself, harmonious music appears. So that under the effect of music, the 5 social duties are without admixture, the eyes and ears are clear, the blood and vital spirits are reformed, customs are improved, the empire is in complete peace. Tones arise from the human heart, and music is connected with the principles of human conduct. Therefore the animals know sounds, but do not know tones. And the common people know tones, but do not know music. Only the superior man is able to understand music. Thus, from a study of the sounds, one comes to understand the tones. From a study of the tones, one comes to understand the music. And from the study of music, one comes to understand the principles of government, and is thus fully prepared for being a ruler. So, for that first passage of the 2nd chapter, what's going on there? Now, so suddenly, we're getting into someone like Confucius connecting things like the independent person, music, and then the state, right? The state being society. And there's a connection there. So suddenly, it's not just, again, this innocuous thing where it's just like, oh yeah, I'm just a dude, I'm gonna listen to some music, right? It matters what kind of music. And if enough people are tuned into that kind of music, quote unquote, whether it's good or bad, it's gonna have an effect as a society on a whole. That makes complete sense, right? So once again, it's going to show that music is not just like this innocuous thing. It needs to be regarded with a certain level of prudence, a certain level of restraint, and without it, you put in danger society itself, which is wild, right? A second passage I like to share with you from chapter 2 has to do with Pythagoras. And so let's get into it. Basil Cole writes, Pythagoras was the first among the Greeks of whom we know to develop the idea of music as ethical and therapeutic, capable of strengthening or restoring harmony to the soul. A man whose soul is in harmony is a virtuous man. Order, proportion, and measure are the essence of life. Music is then used to attain virtue, parentheses, ethical perfection, end parentheses, by fostering these properties. In addition, music provides a catharsis or purification of the soul, a vital, psychical, and physical force. In a general way, music for the Greeks was considered a physic for the soul. This is the third passage from the second chapter that I'm going to share with you that I liked, that stood out. And this has to do with, of course, the man Plato. So Basil Cole writes, Plato's thesis is that music has moral or immoral effects. That is, it has a power to further a kind of education called kalokagathia. The opposite is also true. It can enervate and corrupt the soul. It is also quite clear that he held that rhythms imitate the good or the bad in human beings, and so can influence the listener. Although music is described as entertainment in the Symposium 176e, in the Republic, he says that it is not meant for pleasure or entertainment, but is to lead on to a well-balanced order in the individual and in the state. In his more mature work, he says that pleasure and entertainment are not substitutes for truth and symmetry. Music is described as something which sinks into the depths of the soul and remains there. It is the medicine of the soul. Okay, now we're going to get into the chapter 3. It's called New Music in the Making, from the Fathers to Aquinas. And this is the first passage that really stood out to me. Basil Cole writes, because the playing of music was so common among the various cultures around Palestine, there was a tendency on the part of some fathers to refer to musical instruments as metaphors for spiritual realities. For example, Clement of Alexandria calls Christ the harp, sometimes the pipe as well as the temple, the minstrel of the believer. He is in favor of training the young in certain instruments. Since David used the harp and the lyre for accompaniment, yet in other places he attacks them and the flute, the dance, and, quote, amatory quavering, end quote. So what's going on in that first passage I read to you from chapter 3? So you've got a guy who refers to someone like Christ as the harp, right? It's not the drum or some sort of an allos, right? It's not even a voice. It's the harp, right? In this instance, in one instance, and that's increasingly interesting, right? So now we're connecting music to divinity, and we're making those sort of connections there. And as such, since we're connecting divinity, I will now read and connect some more insight from the Bible itself, and shed some more insight as to how this idea of music being used as a tool for a very specific purpose in one instance here. And so let's get on with it. I'm reading, of course, the book of Samuel, and here's the certain passage that I'm going to read to you that relates to that. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servant said unto him, Behold now, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. Let our Lord now command thy servants which are before thee to seek out a man who is a cunning player on an harp. And it shall come to pass when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. And Saul said unto his servants, Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. Then answered one of the servants, and said, Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. Wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse, and said, Send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. And Jesse took an ass laden with bread and a bottle of wine and a kid, and sent them by David and his son unto Saul. And David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. All right, so in reading that passage from the Bible, thanks be to God, that is powerful, right? So not only are we getting into the realm of music having a connection with the divine itself, but being so powerful that it's for all intents and purposes is used as an exorcism tool, right? What are we talking about? This sort of a certain kind of instrument, the harp, being played by a man to cast out an evil spirit. That is wild, right? But it's not unheard of. There's information out there of exorcisms being taken place that uses things like Gregorian chants to cast out demons, right? So these things exist, right? There's so much going on to it than just a random Pink Floyd guitar solo. I mean, it's so strong, it's so powerful that it can cast out demons. That's wild. So, next passage in the chapter 3, New Music in the Making. This has to do with this peculiar instrument called the aulos. The aulos, of course, has a certain reputation in the music world. You know, I'm not going to pretend like I'm an aulos expert, but from what I've read, the aulos is not typically regarded as a musical instrument that's meant to promote the good in people. I'll put it that way. And so here's this passage that I really liked. So Basil Cole writes, A word of caution is in order. It has to be kept in mind that those fathers who were negative about the music of their period were not making aesthetic judgments about pure music as we know it, a recent art by historical standards. Rather, most of these fathers condemned the drunkenness and the lewd dances which in many instances were associated with it. Clement of Alexandria, for example, says, Let carousing be absent from our rational enjoyment, and also foolish vigils which revel in drunkenness. Let lust, intoxication, and irrational passions be far removed from our native choir. The regular movements of aioli, solitaries, choruses, dances, Egyptian clappers, and other such playthings become altogether indecent and uncouth, especially when joined by beating cymbals and tympana, and accompanied by the noisy instruments of deception. Such a symposium, it seems to me, becomes nothing but a theater of drunkenness. We still got more to go. Basil Cole writes, here we must keep in mind the obvious immoral context in which the instruments and music were used. In another place, Clement mentions that the syrinx and aulos were used to trap animals or help them mate. Likewise, the very same instruments can lead men to become obsessed with, quote, bestial, end quote, experiences. Further, he says that, quote, temperate, end quote, as distinct from, quote, chromatic, end quote, harmonies, parentheses, what today we call the use of flats and sharps in scales, end parentheses, are to be admitted, but pliant harmonies are to be, quote, driven as far as possible from a robust mind. These, through their sinuous strains, instruct one in weakness and lead to ribaldry. But graceful and temperate melodies bid farewell to the arrogance of drunkenness. Somewhat later, Gregory of Nazianzus will say that musicians who play the aulos represent the devil. Rocking themselves back and forth as if, quote, to flaunt themselves blasphemously before the inhabitants of heaven, end quote. It is not surprising then to read in the canons of Basil or the Apostolia Constitutions that even learning to play such musical instruments as the aulos or kithara is condemned. So that whole thing is wild, right? It's a huge bomb, right? So a few things we kind of touched on, right? But the one thing I really want to focus on is the instrument, the aulos, right? There's a lot of implications there. The aulos is, of course, played by a certain kind of pagan figure in history, right? Particularly this god, lowercase g, this pagan god known as Pan, right? And he's strutting around with his half human, half kind of this horse kind of legs and body strutting along. He's got his horns and he's playing his aulos, right? Right, that whole thing. And what is he associated with? He's associated with licentiousness, ribaldry, right? This idea of like seducing you with his music, of taking you as a man, right? This, for all intents and purposes, what you should be, a noble, you have a divine essence being, and then taking that and then warping it into and degrading it into some sort of an animal, right? Through the music, through this aulos, right? Through this sort of spell casting, this sort of trance that the aulos is known for. So you've got this idea of corruption of the goodness of man and reducing him to some sort of a beast, some sort of an animal, right? So you're just like being like this jackass, right? And it's wild, right? Because Pan is known to be that he's known for that, being that type of god, right? And it's interesting. So the third passage that I'm going to read to you from the third chapter that really stood out to me, and this has to do with a fellow named Basil the Great, and it's this really wonderful story that he has about Pythagoras. It's awesome. So I'm going to share that with you. And so Basil Cole, the author, writes, continuing the same theme, Basil speaks, as in Basil the Great, Basil speaks of the importance of variety in prayer and psalmody, which restores, quote, concentration, end quote, and, quote, favors the soul with a state of happiness and freedom from care, end quote. Knowing the famous story of Pythagoras, Basil the Great uses it in a letter to youth to develop the sound pastoral principle that morally bad music must be countered with morally good music. Here's the story. The passions born of illiberality and baseness of spirit are naturally occasioned by this sort of music. But we must pursue that other kind, which is better and leads to the better, and which, as they say, was used by David, that author of sacred songs, to soothe the king in his madness. And it is said that Pythagoras, upon encountering some drunken revelers, commanded the all-elite who was leading their song to change the mode and to play the Dorian for them. They were so sobered by this music that, tearing off their garlands, they returned home ashamed. Others danced to the aulos in the manner of the corybantus and the bacchantus. Such is the difference in filling one's ears with the wholesome or wicked tunes. And since the latter type now prevails you must have less to do with it than any utterly depraved thing. All right, so moving along, chapter 4. The first passage I'd like to share with you is, as so, Basil Cole writes, quote unquote, pure, end quote, pure, end quote, music will begin and continue to flower during the late Baroque period, when people are used to hearing changes of keys, counterpoint, and a whole host of other novel musical techniques, including virtuoso solo singing and playing. A kind of glorious zenith will be reached in the works of the Lutheran composer Johannes Sebastian Bach and in George Friedrich Handel. While they never met, both came from Germany and were products of the Reformation era. They in turn passed the creative torch to two other geniuses, Franz Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Here's a second passage I liked from the 4th chapter, and it goes like this. Basil Cole writes, this has to do with a subchapter, Post-Medieval Development through Trent. Basil Cole writes, at the beginning of the 14th century, we find continuing problems earlier noted by Alared and others from the point of view of the appropriateness of some kinds of music in religious setting. There are some who, although they contrive to sing a little in the modern manner, nevertheless they have no regard for quality. They sing too lasciviously. They multiply voices superfluously. Some of them employ the hoquetus too much, breaking, cutting, and dividing their voices into too many consonants. In the most inopportune place they dance, whirl, and jump about on notes, howling like dogs. They bay, and like madmen nourished by disorderly and twisted aberrations, they use a harmony alien to nature herself. So for the third passage of chapter 4, I'd like to share with you, it goes like this. So it's just the idea that Basil Cole points out as he writes, liturgical music must be subordinate to the words and not the other way around. He goes on September 25th, 1884, the Congregation of Sacred Rites issued some rules forbidding, quote, figured, end quote, music. Solos, duets, trios were all right if they possessed the character of sacred music. No polkas, waltzes, mazurkas, minuets, rondos, schottisches, varsivoniuses, quadrilles, contradances, polonaises, national hymns, popular airs, love and comic songs, or ballads were to be tolerated. Noisy instruments such as side and big drums, cymbals, improvisations, and fantasias were forbidden if not played fittingly. Nothing must be allowed to disturb the piety and recollection of the faithful. Basil Cole further breaks down in this chapter. He writes regarding sacred music, Although the music proper to the church is purely vocal music, music with the accompaniment of the organ is also permitted. In some special cases, other instruments were allowed. In some special cases, other instruments are allowed within due limits and proper regard. As chant is the key, organ and instruments should merely sustain and never overwhelm it. That made a lot of sense to me because in going to church, recently at my church, there was a fellow who had I think like a 3 or 4 piece drum set. I don't know, but it was awful. It was awful. You had the booming drums in the middle of mass, which was overbearing to say the very least. I mean, the guy was it seemed like he was improvising the whole thing as he went along.
The right hand is consistent.
There was a cymbal involved, and he was messing around with that. The booming bass was overwhelming so many of the psalms and the hymns throughout the mass, and it honestly seemed like it was just like this kid just hanging around in a toy drum set from Walmart and just making stuff up along as he kind of went along. It was really bad, and I really hope my church doesn't do it again. But thankfully, I don't know if that was just a tryout period, but that's usually not the case. It's really just vocal and the piano, which is great. When I was a kid and going to church, it was actually vocals and somebody playing a guitar. A female person was actually playing the guitar, which is all right. I do like the piano better as an adult. But the drums are way too overbearing. They completely drown out what's happening at church, and I think that I don't know what allowed for that sort of process to happen, what kind of experimentation, but hopefully it doesn't continue. Right, and so getting into the 5th chapter, here's one section I really liked. Basil Cole writes, medicine was often linked with religion, cult, magic, and music because of the belief in their interrelatedness. Music, for example, was alleged to mitigate pain, restore hearing to the deaf, heal vermin bites, and cure the insane. The great surgeon Ambrose Paré mentions that music could cure spider bites, sciatica, and gout. Renaissance doctors thought that music was a form of preventative medicine against the epidemics of the time. Anger, excessive sorrow, and worry were to be shunned as the sources of certain diseases. One must cultivate those joys and pleasures which comfort the mind and the heart. Music helps one to accomplish this. According to Zarlino, parentheses following Plato, end parentheses, the passions are aroused or abated by the hearing of music, and so music has a direct influence over morals. Another interesting phenomena of the early Renaissance and later were the dances of Saint Vitus and Saint John. They were complex, frenzied, and pathological expressions of the emotions bordering on mania, which were thought to be curative of diseases such as the plague. Hordes of people in towns and villages would dance for hours until they fell into exhaustion, and then begin again. But the question of music's relationship to medicine disappears after the Renaissance, only to be revived again in the present century. So with that first passage in chapter 5, that's interesting, right? You know what comes to mind is Elden Ring. So how many of you guys played Elden Ring, right? So came out back last summer, beginning of last summer, played the heck out of it. And I remember this one village where it's this game, right? But I remember this one village you get to, and it's a bunch of women, and they just dance, right? They just dance, and they kind of you hear stories about like this sort of village where they just dance, and there's something weird going on there. So, you know, you get on your horse or whatever, and you go to this village invariably. as part of your exploration or your quest. And you find that at first, when you enter this village, these women, which is interesting, right? There's no men around. It's just women, right? And these women are all dancing. And as you get higher to the cliff, to its zenith, they actually start attacking you. Right? And so you got like these a bunch of these in the game, but you got like these women, these village women, they all start attacking you with like knives, and a lot of them have like red eyes as if they're possessed. Which is interesting, right? And so I have no doubt that that's connected to this sort of folklore, this sort of story. It makes me think of particularly the Bacchae. That's interesting, right? Interestingly enough, when you get to the top of that zenith of that village, you fight like a sort of monster, And I can't remember if upon killing it, it restores the sanity of the women there or not. But it's interesting, right? Here's a second passage from chapter 5 that I really liked. Basil Cole writes, 2 or more psychologists of music, Radosi and Boyle, after studying for years certain traits of stimulative and sedative music, have noted the following phenomena. While rhythm, and particularly tempo, appears to be the predominant energizing factor, dynamic level also appears to serve as a stimulator. Louder music seems to stimulate greater response activity than softer music. Other musical attributes, such as pitch, level, melody, harmony, texture, and timbre, also may help energize music. But the extent to which these variables contribute towards the driving, energizing force of music is less clearly understood than for rhythm and dynamics. Music which soothes, calms, or tranquilizes behavior appears to rely on sounds that are non-percussive and legato. Its melodic passages are sustained legato and generally have a minimum of rhythmic activity. The most important rhythmic attribute of sedative music is the underlying beat, which is usually monotonously regular but subdued. Lullabies are the primary example of functional sedative music. The dynamic level usually is quite soft. The tempo is generally much slower than for stimulative music, and the melody's frequency range appears to be quite limited. Actually, for chapter 5, this is the third passage that really stood out to me, and Basil Cole writes the following. In the 1930s, the Muzak Corporation was formed. They set out to prove that music can, if used in background situations, have certain positive effects. Their quote-unquote easy listening music, end quote, is aimed at persons who are primarily engaged in tasks or activities other than listening to music. It is ubiquitous in the United States today in places where people work, study, shop, or play. It is found in restaurants, hotel lobbies, doctors' and dentists' office, subways, elevators, airplanes, and the industry. Elevators, airplanes, and industry. It is said to dissipate feelings of loneliness, enhance relaxation, mask unwanted sounds, and stimulate conversation. It is supposed to give, quote, a boost to boost, unquote, to listeners and reduce fatigue and boredom. Parentheses, sedative, end parentheses, music tends to increase gross sales when used in retail situations. This says something about consumerism and the problem of avarice. If the purpose of the background music is to encourage the selling of goods for its own sake, and even to mask the lack of quality in the goods purchased, then one begins to find a real moral question regarding its use. As Joseph Piper says, quote, this light music, end quote, or happy sound, by its sheer banality, can express quite accurately the cheap self-deception that on the inner existential level all is fine. There is nothing to worry about. Everything is in good order, really, end quote. This often is not the case. Yet such easy listening, happy harmonies, and superficial melodies tend to promote superficiality in the soul and an implicit turning away from the struggle and search for absolute goodness itself. I don't know, you've got like this music culture that celebrates vice, but it completely ignores the consequences of engaging in those vices, right? You've got this rap and music culture that says, yeah,
Have all the sex you want, smoke all the weed you want, do all the drugs that you want, right? It's all good, but it's just like,
wait a minute, no it's not. There's consequences of that. What if you get someone pregnant? What if you become addicted to other kinds of drugs because you've been smoking weed for so long? Maybe you need something harder, and then you go into heroin, you go do other things, right? That's why it's known as a gateway drug. But it makes it so cool, right? It makes you think, it puts that spell on you. It's just like, yeah, smoke weed every day, fuck all these hoes, and do all these things. But what is it doing to you? It's taking your divine essence as a human being, and it's reducing you into an animal. But I digress. Won't preach to you any longer. This has been a fantastic read. It's a quick read. I give it a 10 out of 10. Music and Morals by Basil Cole. Check it out and stay tuned for my future book reviews. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Catch me on my Instagram. Thanks very much. Peace.